So our focus today, as you understood, will be South Asian women artists in Paris. And we're going to discuss more precisely 3 women artists, Zarina Hashmi, that is, though she preferred to go by her first name, Novera Ahmed, and Zubeida Agha. And through them, we're also going to try and understand the validity, the meaning of these terms, unpack them a little bit. What is it to be a South Asian in those years, more specifically in Paris, because the way we brought them together is because they all spent some amount of time in Paris. What is it to be a woman artist in those years, both in their place where they made art and in the different places that at some point in their life they considered home? And how did that differ also from being a woman artist in Pakistan, perhaps, or in Paris or in New York, in the case of Zarina? So these are just some of the subjects that we hope to broach. We only have an hour, so we'll cover as much as possible. And to begin with, I wanted to ask all 3 of you how you first encountered these artists. I know sometimes you may have known them, met them. Is it through their archives? Is it through their work? And what makes them as not just their biography, but their artworks, their production? What makes it unique and special to you?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Thank you very much. I think what draws me to Novera Ahmed was specifically her art, first of all, which was very unique and modern in the context of her times. She was born in 1930, and they say that she was born in the jungle of Bangladesh, which is known as the Sundarbans, and after that grew up in Kolkata. After that, there was the partition and she moved to Bangladesh. And then from there, she went abroad to London in order to study at the Camberwell School. Her art represents a significant departure in terms of modern style, approach. And generally speaking, she has experimented with a number of mediums. For example, there's a touch of architecture where she designed a memorial. There is the sculpture where she has experimented in metal, in cement. And there is also painting, which she did, especially at the near the last 3 decades, you could say, of her life. And in each of them, she looked at a modern representation of what you could say as Indian mythology, of Bangladeshi terracotta work, of even Zen Buddhism, in which she was very interested. So these are very powerful themes. And I think that when I first saw them at her house, her atelier, this was 2019. She died in 2015, as you can probably see in, I don't know, in one of the slides, you'll see that. So I never really met her, as she did not meet a lot of people because she went into sort of self-seclusion. But her art speaks about a lot of the trauma that she encountered. And this was so powerful. And secondly, I think it was important to just understand her life as she lived abroad, almost in exile for about 50 years, most of the time in Paris, and then later on outside Paris. So the combination of a life and a legacy, the way she approached, the different issues of her times, her personal ones, brings together a very unique message, which I think needs to be actually presented and pulled together.
Thank you. So for me, Zubeida Agha, I'm a little bit biased because being from Pakistan and interested in modern Pakistani artists, and in particular women as well. And I think because my career started off in the commercial sphere, I was looking at the artists that were doing well in the modern art market. So that included Sadiq Khan and Bashir Mirza, who are men. And so I kept thinking, what about the women? How are they exposed? How do they work in the art historical reference? And that's how I came across Zubeida Agha, who in my eyes, and I think most people's eyes, as you can see over here, is probably considered the first modern abstract artist from the country. And she was able to make a deep impact, not only with the way she painted, but the way she taught and the institutions that she opened up and worked on as well in Pakistan. And I think her legacy is incredibly important, and her time in Paris and London and otherwise was also crucial to the way she worked as an artist, but also as an art administrator as well.
And so the question being, how did I come to Zarina? for the simple reason that I've always been interested in her work, and I have written on contemporary Indian art. But I was especially interested in her also because the kind of very spare, minimal work she does is rare in India. And of course, the most emblematic example of that kind of abstraction is, of course, Nasreen Mohammadi, whom Zarina knew very well and was a very good friend. And incidentally, I think both born in the same year. But my interest in Zarina's work was also I was intrigued by the way the abstraction is not just a formal concern for her, but also how the abstraction encodes various kinds of subject positions, and most prominently being, of course, the fact of being sort of not really living in, the fact of living in several different places throughout her life. And I think the idea of home, of returning home, even if it's an imaginary projection, is very much inscribed in these apparently abstract works. Although later on, she does refer specifically to forms like the house, the rudimentary shape of the house. But so there's always a kind of inkling of a shelter in some of her drawings, as there is also an idea about frontiers and boundaries, and of course there are references to I think the partition of India, which was the sort of valedictory act of the British, is inscribed in her work as well. What intrigues me also, these concerns about home. Of course, homelessness is a spiritual condition in the modern period par excellence. But I think there's a particular inflection given to it by Zarina because she actually lived it since she was born in Aligarh, which is a predominantly Muslim city, and of course, then she moved to Delhi, but she had family in Pakistan. Because she happened to sort of be married to a diplomat, which obviously took her to very different places in the world. And so there was always that a kind of I think, a yearning for a home which probably never existed. So that's how I came to her work. And when I had the occasion to do an exhibition for a private foundation in Belgium, I included her work along with Nasreen and other women abstract artists. It wasn't just an exhibition of women artists, to counterbalance the kind of figurative representational art which predominates in contemporary Indian art. So that was also a way of suggesting another dimension to contemporary Indian art, which was abstract and curiously happened to be practiced by women. So when I mentioned Nasreen and Zarina and a younger artist called Prabha Mepayil, so that's what brought me to her.
Thank you. Before we move to their time in Paris, a follow-up question I wanted to ask is about the recognition of their work. And here, the three artists may differ slightly, of course, and we're seeing some slides, and you included, Nour, how some of the artworks that you're showing by Zubeida Agha are represented, exhibited at the moment in the Venice Biennale. So this is, I guess, a sign of current recognition, but was it always so? And is there a difference between her status in Pakistan and elsewhere? And same for Novera. That also leads me to how you managed to conduct research on them, because I know that is an issue. And in the book that just came out on Zubeida Agha by Sarah Ansari, which is published by the École des Modernités of the Institut Giacometti, she also goes into that, the difficulty of conducting research. And I was just going through the book and reading that book recently, not just going through it. And one of the things she says always is, this person said that, and I have found that it is true, the archive said so, and this person says that, and I have found no way of corroborating it, of validating that in the archives. So just 2 words on how to conduct research on them, how you have, and more generally speaking, how one can, and on recognition. And sometimes the two go together because it's very difficult to elevate an artist if one is having so much difficulties conducting research. And this is perhaps less addressed to you, Deepak, because Zarina was alive and had also retrospective exhibitions, and you exhibited her work during her lifetime. But perhaps there's something to be said about her legacy too, and what is happening to her works today.
Well, I can start off with Zubeida saying that, thank you to Saira Ansari for helping me put this talk together. And she was very generous with all the archives that she was able to share as well. But she kept saying that during her time in Paris, even though she studied here and she was technically enrolled in as a student, she wasn't they kept calling her an apprentice rather than a student. And so anytime she's trying to find research about what Zubeida Agha was able to do in her time in Paris, she was able to find that. She has her exhibition details and photos of it, which is all well and fine. But then going back to Pakistan, where she very much was recognized in the country, there's no question about that. She was given many awards during her time, well, later on in life. There's no real record of what she was capable of doing, but it was only through different verbal conversations that she was able to have with other people. Because like Saiful said about Novera, Zubeida she became very reclusive as well. She wasn't really integrated into the community, even though she was respected and everyone wanted to talk to her, and she was able to set up so many different institutions, and that was because of her time in Paris. She kept to herself quite a lot as well. And so there's something to be said about that too. So,
thank you. Well, I think Novera is probably one of the most difficult lives to actually research, for the simple reason that she made it even more difficult. Having been born in 1930 and having gone to London for her art schooling, and at that time she actually worked with Karel Vogel, very famous sculptor, Jacob Epstein, and then later on she went to Italy, spent time with Venturino, Venturi over there, and she also, in Paris, she circulated amongst different groups such as the Cobra movement and then Giacometti and so on. However, she never gave a single interview. She never left anything in writing. And she almost made it a point that if you want to understand me, then look at my art. I do not want to put any interpretations on it. The second, I think, reason for it was that she really, and perhaps I'm judging it a little bit, but she really was almost a target or a victim of the patriarchal systems over there. And therefore the recognition, which is another part of your questions, really did not come in the manner or the support that should have been given. She did win the first prize in the Pakistan National Exhibition in 1960. She even designed the memorial that I spoke about. But the recognition for that went to the male partner and rather than to herself. So it is very difficult that only her work survives, and even out of that, almost 40% has been lost during various transitions. There is a few books and articles on her. One or two of them she read during her lifetime, and she said this is more fantasy than a biography, so she almost discounted them. However, there is a small piece of writing where she insists that art must become a part of our everyday lives. And she said art must come into hospitals, must come into hotels, must come into residences. She mentions that. And there's this very small thesis, part of it that survives in terms of sculpture and dance, because she is very, very involved in Indian classical dance, and she won medals in that too. What really comes through, I think, is that in the later part, when she was in Paris, her partner and later husband at that time, who was with her from the 60s, kind of like late 60s onwards, has some information. He's still alive. He has information. Not that she shared much. I mean, she spoke fluently English, French, Bangla, Hindi, but she refused to take a French passport, even though her work was bought by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs over here. She said, I'm a Bangladeshi, first and foremost. She always wore a sari. She always kind of loved Bangladeshi sweets and so on. So she maintained an identity, almost like an island within France itself. So it's not an easy matter, but I think that is the challenge of it. The challenge is to rediscover, what were her primary drivers, to look at her work and to see the themes, the genres, the geography that she crossed, and to come out with a feeling of what went through, and to tie it up with the social political and economic history of the country at that time. So those are the ways that you trace it out, I think.
Well, as far as Zarina is concerned, there's not really a problem about archives or material because she died very recently. And she did have a show with galleries. I mean, the gallery she had is later. I mean, she had galleries, of course, in India, but also in Paris, so there's no problem as far as that's concerned. But in terms of what you suggested about, asked about legacies, I think that's something more. I think it's a rather slightly belated recognition, not just of her work or her contribution, but also in terms of, I think paradoxically, although she didn't live in India, but like Nasreen Mohammadi, the kind of abstraction she practiced was marginalized because the main trends in contemporary Indian art from, let's say, just even from the late 70s onwards, although there was abstraction happening in India, but it was overtaken by figurative art, by representational art, rather polemically so by its partisans. And so for a long time, I mean, this kind of abstraction, like Nasreen's or like Zarina's, was in a sense, was appreciated. It had kind of succès d'estime, but it wasn't sort of, hadn't become part of a kind of mainstream contribution or legacy, which is now, I think, obviously changing because of the fact that, I mean, because of this kind of sort of sea change in attitudes towards so-called marginal forms of expression. And of course, the fact that, of course, art made by women is sort of no longer a question of any kind of bias anymore. But I think in her time there was I mean, she was esteemed, but I don't suppose she got the kind of recognition she deserved, which is the same with Nasreen as well. I think the first time an international audience actually came to see Nasreen was in Kassel, in Documenta. And Zarina's sort of important show, which happened at the Hammer Museum in California, the University of California, and then went to the Guggenheim and then to the Art Institute of Chicago, was again a rather late moment, but it was a crowning moment really in her work, in her life. So.
Absolutely. And I wonder with Zarina also of the fact that she wasn't, contrary to Nasreen, that she wasn't in India, whether Baroda or Delhi, where some of these other artists clustered, also mattered. And all three women artists we're discussing are profoundly individual. I don't want to use the term individualist because that sounds negative, but they have a very distinct trajectory. And there's something about their persona, which you explained so well in the case of Novera Saiful. That leads me to another theme we wanted to approach, which is what Paris meant for them. If you can just first remind us also the years in which they were in Paris. They never met. So that was a question we were asking ourselves. Did they meet? Was there ever a conversation in a cafe in Paris? No, there wasn't. So just for you to be clear about that. But if you can tell us how long they were in Paris and most importantly, what they got out of Paris. And sometimes it's, as we know, not about training or art making. It's about something different. Is it about more freedom as a woman artist? Is it about institution building? Or what do they get out of it? And what does Paris mean for them, perhaps along other sites of production and other homes that they built? If you can also locate it vis-a-vis other cities that mattered for them.
Should I?
Oh, please.
Sorry, no. Well, I think Zarina was in Paris from 64 to 67, and she studied with William Hayter, which was the kind of place to go when you came to Paris and wanted to study printmaking. And she does recall that he was a very supportive presence. Of course, she learned a lot about printmaking when she was in Paris. But and he did sort of encourage her to pursue a career as an artist. And so I think, and certainly in Paris, she did see a lot of work. and given the fact that she was married to a diplomat, suggests that she was already part of some kind of cosmopolitan milieu. But so, I mean, she says that, I mean, her time in Paris was spent looking at, she mentions Noam Gabo, Pevsner, which are English artists, but she mentions them, but having seen them in Paris, but also Brancusi, of course, and Vieira da Silva, and Malevich. So I think that's a kind of sort of formative period in Paris. We don't know very much about which other artists she saw or she met, but one would think that because she was at Haters, which was a place which was very international in terms of the artists who came to study with him. So obviously she was, in contact with people who, during those years, with other people who were studying in Paris in his Atelier 17. But in New York, I think when she moves to New York in 77, first to California and then to New York, she was associated with the group of women behind a journal called Heresies, which was a kind of feminist journal, as she took part in another exhibition, which was again of women artists. And so through that connection, she was familiar. She met Lucy Lippard, and she knew about her writings, and she also was particularly drawn to Anna Mendieta and Louise Bourgeois. And so I think she tended to be a rather reserved person. And earlier on, I wanted to say about the kind of visibility which came a bit late. I think it's also the kind of sort of refinement and discretion of her work is something that it also goes along with her as a kind of reticent person, which I think when one thinks of Agnes Martin, for example, there's a nice parallel there as well in terms of someone who is not... who prefers to be, not in the limelight, so to speak, although there are other women artists who are more flamboyant. And just to sort of, as an aside, when I say flamboyant, when you think about the emblematic modern Indian painter, Amrita Shergill, who was at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris during the 30s, I mean, she was the exact opposite of any kind. I mean, she was perfectly at home in Paris, and etc. So have I digressed? I mean, I'm in terms of sort of to go back to Zarina.
I've answered the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just to go off of what you just said, I was actually, when I was thinking about this discussion and how we were going to go about it, I was able to speak to Zuhur Akhlaq's daughter, Noor Jahan Akhlaq, who said that actually he and his wife, Scheherazade Alam, were able to meet Zarina when she was in Paris,
right,
and actually got to know each other a bit better when they all went to New York. So Zuhur Akhlaq and Scheherazade Alam were Pakistani artists and, were very well known in that region as well. And then as I was reading through the documents that were shared to me by Saira Ansari, which I'm very thankful for, she said that actually Zubeida Agha was able to see Amrita Shergill's exhibition, not here, but obviously time difference, but in Lahore, her last exhibition there. So there was a...
Really?
Because she learned about her in Paris. So that's also a nice little connect that I found there. Zubeida Agha, born in 1922, she came to Paris from 1951 to 1953. And she was at the, please excuse my pronunciation, she was at the L'École des Beaux-Arts?
Beaux-Arts.
Thank you. See, I knew I would mess it up a little bit. Yeah. And she was able to have an exhibition in 1952 at the Galerie Henri Tonche. Thank you very much. Yeah. And so I think when it comes to her practice, she had an understanding of what she wanted to do because she had already studied. She was at Central St. Martin's the year before in 1950. So she was able to study what she was interested in, which is cubism, abstraction. She was looking at different colors and she was looking at all these different variations. And her form of work was very different from what was happening in modern Pakistani art at that time. But from what I have understood from the reading readings is that Zubeida Agha was actually able to think about how institutions work and how institutions are formed around and for the artists. So what does it mean to store artworks? How do you put an exhibition together? How are you thinking about the ecosystem that helps the artist at the end of the day? Because it is all for the artists that we are doing all this work. And so when she went back to Pakistan in 1953, she was able to help set up the Contemporary Art Gallery in Rawalpindi, and she was also able to help the PNCA, which is a museum in Islamabad. And so she was really thinking about institutions and how they're built, and she was trying to pass it on to the next generation as well. And it was very important for her that that stability stayed within these spaces.
Thank you. Well, we are in Paris, so how can one criticize this city? All right. I love the definition that was given by Harold Rosenberg, I think, where he said that in the 60s, Paris was a mixture of Viennese psychology, of American detective novels, of African sculpture and German know-how and Italian nihilism, is what he said. And you could probably add a bit of Bengali sweets to that. Generally speaking, I think Novera, who studied in the UK and from 1951 till 1954, she visited Paris in between, and she actually liked the sculptures of Rodin, and went around over here. She got to know some of the artists over here too, but then she left and went back again. When she returned from in 1964 to Paris, and then went off to Bangkok in 1967, and then returned again in 1973, after which she lived in Paris. And I think France, and especially Paris, was a very important stepping stone for her, because she was looking for creative and personal independence. And Paris, in its bohemian nature, represented that. One must understand that in Bengal, there was a sort of Bengal Renaissance that one speaks about in the sort of 19th century, where there was a lot of liberalism, and where figures like Rabindranath Tagore and Begum Rokeya, who actually fought for feminism, which is why Bengal women got the right to vote in 1925, as opposed to Swiss women who got it in 1971 or something. So there was a lot of Renaissance over there and activities that were happening. And that sort of struck a chord with the French Renaissance, perhaps, which happened about 100 years before that. And to Novera, these two, because she was very fascinated by the fact of this rebirth, this represented a very good opportunity to actually showcase her work. She had two shows in Paris, one in 1973 at the Galerie Rive Gauche, again mispronunciations probably, and a second one in her own gallery, Sielski, which happened in 2014, a retrospective. And in both of these, there were very favorable comments. Some of the artworks were actually bought at that particular time. So this was very important for her. However, I must also say that I think by the 1980s, Paris had lost a little of the charm that it initially had for her. And she wanted to move away from the city, and she moved off to La Roche-Guyon, something like about an hour and a half from here. And she lived over there for the next 25 years. And to her, that was close to nature, to the flora and fauna that she loved, and it gave her that sense of isolation that she also thrived in to some extent. So yes, Paris was extremely important in terms of her initial flowering, in terms of meeting others. And there are in her sculptures, there's one over here. This is the Bangkok phase. This is Icarus, which is the metal one. This is another one, which is sort of a spray painting that she was doing with metal parts. I think there's another one which is probably before this. This one, they say that the Giacometti, like for example, the clean lines that you can see in this ebony finish over here with the little African head, it shows the mix of genres. And over there, that particular one is probably one of the most dramatic sculptures, Exterminating Angel. Again, there was no doubt about the influence of European lines, but of very, very strong Bengal themes that comes through over here. So I would really say Paris, she loved it. She loved a particular brand of French champagne also, which is the only one that she drank. So there's no doubt about it. But in the end, she also moved out of Paris.
Nour, you mentioned that Zubeida got to know about Amrita Shergill in Paris, though then the exhibition you mentioned was in...
Sorry, no. So she knew about sorry, I said that.
Did I get it wrong?
No, I said it wrong. And I realized that as Saiful was talking, I was like, I need to correct myself. No, she learned about the school by going to Amrita Shergill's exhibition in Lahore because she was there from 51 to 53. And the exhibition, I think, happened in 1947 in Lahore.
So she learned
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that.
So it was the other
But
way.
you
My
also spoke about
apologies.
artists congregated. You mentioned Zahul Akhlaq, and that's what I'm getting to.
Yeah.
So a broader question is, does Paris or perhaps other places like London matter for South Asian artists to congregate? Because, of course, it was so difficult for them. Though there are exceptions. There are some Indian artists who are able to exhibit in Pakistan. There are other exceptions. We can name them. They don't pertain to the artists we're discussing. But it was difficult for reasons of citizenship to travel, to hold connections, to exhibit between East and West Pakistan after the Liberation War of 71, between India and Pakistan. Was Paris, were London, perhaps New York also, were these places that allowed for a form of being South Asian and meeting other South Asian artists? Is that something that your artist, quote unquote, spoke about or that you could tell us about?
I think it's a bit of a two-pronged approach when it comes to that. So I know that obviously Zubeida Agha had exhibited in Pakistan, but I know Zarina Hashmi had, and I know Novera Ahmed had as well. I think because these three women in particular were able to have the privilege to travel abroad, they were able to exhibit abroad and be able to meet other South Asian artists abroad as well. I think because of colonization and global histories, people were able to, again, meet abroad. But initially, I think it was much easier to travel within the region, whereas today it's probably not. So if you go back into certain archives for different galleries, you'll see that other modern artists from Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan have exhibited together, but it is in either London, New York, or Paris, or somewhere else. So then what does that mean in regards to how people are showcasing? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, I think they did conglomerate and meet and have like a small community within themselves when they were in these different cities. But then I also think that initially there were meeting spaces within our own countries as well. But because of global politics, I don't think it became more and more difficult. And so that's why meeting outside of the region has become easier at this point. That's why we're all here right now too. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, sometimes it's said in South Asia that the shortest distance is a circle instead of being a straight line. You know, we often travel around in order to get to know each other better. For Novera, I think that she actually was active during a period when the countries were just separating and finding a different identity for themselves. So, for example, the India's partition, Pakistan, 1947, the time when she actually moved across to East Pakistan and then grew up over there. Then again, returning back, and then she going to West Pakistan, and then coming out of there was Bangladesh happening in 1971. So she sort of, her work and her period fell between the cracks, if one understands that. I think that is one particular geopolitical coincidence. I think the other one was that the opportunities that one gets in order to actually see the works of Western artists and how to sort of adapt them. I don't think any of the artists ever copied them, but I think it was a question of transmuting, of adapting those works, of using those unique motifs that they had within themselves. Those opportunities came over here. Today, I think if I'm going to the question about South Asia, though we are 7, some say 8 countries over there, the difficulties exist because I think it's a question of some sort of politics, a combination of that, some sort of inherent almost animosity between some of these places, which restricts, unfortunately, the free flow of ideas across these countries. And Novera, for if I speak about her, was a firm believer in almost a united India. I mean, she loved the idea of India staying together, of even Pakistan staying together, because she thought that the colonial rule had very expertly divided us into different regions and therefore reduced us. So for her, it was very important that she would just delve very impartially into anything she liked. And she visited India about 8 times more than any other country, actually. And so she was very, very willing to dip into the cultures of other countries.
What about Zarina and the issue of border and borderlessness in her work?
Yes, I think as I alluded earlier on, it's sort of I think the border is an idea, and also probably is a kind of originary trauma when you think about the partition of India. But from there on, she moved to lots of places and lived in lots of places. I think paradoxically that was also the idea of homelessness was also a way of being at home everywhere, wherever she found herself, I think. Which is why, she came to India often when she was based in New York. So it wasn't as if she was, she was aware of what was happening, in Europe and America, but also what was happening in India. So I think her work sort of foregrounds the arbitrariness of borders on one level, but it's also, I think, one also needs to keep in focus that it also wants to be a statement in lines, and so there's that abstract quality which is very important, obviously. So I think that's a fine dividing line between her own trajectories and the subjective sort of undertows of those displacements, and but also at the same time a kind of a sense of being at home in the world, really. That's how I would think of it.
Perhaps on those words, we should open up and ask if there are questions in the room. I think we have a microphone.
And I just wanted to add just one last thing on a formal level. When you mentioned South Asia, and I think it comes into her work very differently, because I think Zarina's work is all about also about a certain aesthetics of silence, and it's also about even visually, formally, the work is about intervals, spaces between lines, and that kind of punctuation, that kind of respiration is also very important in terms of sort of because it does reflect an interest in Far Eastern aesthetics. She'd been to Japan, and so the idea about emptiness, about which is so important in the Japanese way of describing a void, for example, goes hand in hand with her interest in Muslim Islamic architecture, obviously, in these wonderful musharrabiyes, these partitions between inside and outside, which again then is indexed to the idea about a shelter, about home, etc. So I think there's a kind of syncretism where Asia, things from different parts of Asia get assimilated and acquire the kind of concision and spareness which was her signature.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding this very important point. Do we have questions in the room? I have many more otherwise, but if you want to take a few minutes to gather your thoughts, we have a microphone, as I was saying, at the back. Yes, we have one here in the front.
Well, thank you for the talk. It was really insightful. I had a question about, when you talk about a lot of these artists exploring the idea of the lost home and going back to, finding that home, I wonder how the experience of, finding that home differs for male and female artists, especially from South Asia, in the diaspora. And I was wondering if there is a relationship with the idea of ownership of land and how that differs for the male and female experience, especially in South Asia. When you talk about the dichotomy and, like the male and female, I guess, right to owning land and the different relationships that they have with land. And obviously a lot of feudalism and how different it was back then. So I wonder if you could comment on that, and especially when it comes to the difference between men and women artists from the region.
Yeah, I'll say, look, Zubeida Agha was born in 1922, right? So she was 25 when the partition happened. So she was born in India, and then she ended up being in Pakistan. And she was patriotic. She wasn't nationalistic, though. She didn't have a family, she didn't have a husband, she didn't have children, anything like that. But she was able to be in a space of privilege, which gave her the means to travel around. And I think also when it comes to men and women and owning property, it's very different, because Zubeida was able to inherit what she had and she was able to keep what she had. And in fact, now like her great niece, Saira Ansari, is doing all this work on her. And she's able to go back to her family home where Zubeida lived, where she's able to work on that and process that. But I also know male artists from Pakistan, some of them were able to do that, some of them were not. In regards to Zubeida, she was very reclusive, and I think that has a lot to do with the patriarchy as well. Actually, I was just having this discussion with my own family last night, where my Pakistan ID has to have my husband's name and my father's name on it, because apparently I am no one without them. So that's also very bizarre. And that's probably the way Zubeida thought. That's probably the way she thought as well. Obviously, I have no idea, but that is something that is to consider. It's worthwhile. So I'm sure it was a struggle in some capacity in that way. Absolutely.
Well, in the case of Novera, I think there is almost a clear-cut open and shut case about the patriarchy that existed. For example, one of her most important contributions in terms of the language memorial, where she was the principal designer and there was another gentleman, her partner at that time, Hamidur Rahman. I mean, today, the books are filled with mostly his names rather than hers. Even when she returned back and the School of Fine Arts, I mean, that was opening, there was no offer that was made for her to start off with the sculpture, obviously, in which she had been trained, and to use her as the principal person to teach that over there. She also looked for support in the creative field, and I think that there was a shortage of that, not only because of the fact that the sculpture was at its very nascent stage at that time, but also I think a degree of more fascination with her personal life rather than her creative side over there. I think even then, Novera never identified herself as a feminist as such. It is true that in South Asia, and I think Salima Hashmi says it, that women were expected to be artistic rather than artists. And as Linda says in her book, Nour says in her book, she says that men were treated as great artists, while women were recognized as making the effort to be great artists rather than being great artists. So the division was there, and often their efforts were swept under the carpet. Coming to the question of land as such, I mean, those followed the social practices that existed at that time, which essentially gave more privileges to the male in the family. And that privilege extended even, as I said, in the arts to a large extent. But today, I would say that those differences are far less, okay? However, they still exist, and I think it's still a bit of a struggle for females over there. Novera was never interested in land or in property as such at all. And in terms of her own name, she dropped the Ahmed at the end. So Novera Ahmed dropped it to just Novera. That is what she wanted to be recognized as such. So she wanted to be free of any encumbrances in terms of land or in terms of wealth and as such. All she wanted was a certain amount of metal, pigment, and that was it.
I don't know whether I have anything to say in this particular question. As I think when you mentioned home and then you mentioned land, so I don't think the land was really something which was, important. I mean, was a preoccupation for Zarina, but I'd go back to the idea of about home being a kind of spiritual place, and also I think it harks back to Virginia Woolf when she talks about the rooms of one's own. So in a sense, a house of one's own. So we're talking about women who are, who are not oppressed, or it's more a question. It's a more philosophical or spiritual questions which they're addressing when they talk about home or land. So.
Are there more questions? There's something I wanted to ask you about, so I'll use up my great capacity as chair to do so. Is if you could tell us a little bit more about how ASAP is involved also in archiving projects, but especially providing the opportunities for others to do so who may not have otherwise. And if you want to talk also, perhaps mention at least a grant from the House and Words Institute. I think that would be great because it just happened. So
Yes.
people may not be aware of it in this room.
Yeah. No, so first of all, I just want to thank Devika, Deepak, and Saiful as well. I got the idea of doing this talk having gone to see the Arab Presence exhibition in August in Paris. And I thought, it's wonderful to see all the Arab artists represented who were based in Paris and how their work influenced it. So let's talk about the South Asians too as much as we can. So thank you so much for being part of this. And so with Art South Asia Project, really, when we work in this space, we're trying to figure out ways as to how we connect South Asia further with each other. And one of the things that Mala and I consistently think about is archiving and how important it is to archive. So even through this discussion, we understand like Zarina was able to see it in her lifetime, and there is a lot of archiving on her comparatively to Zubeida and Novera as well, being the reclusive women that they were and not really being, they didn't really want to share that much. So we are very happy to announce that 2 days ago, we have been given a grant by Hauser Wirth Institute in America that will be able to train 20 different people in South Asia with the skill of archiving. And it is a partnership that we're doing with Asia Art Archive in India. And we are incredibly excited about it. It will be launched next year. We will be doing a meetup in Nepal, and we will be working with Photo Kathmandu and Nepal Picture Library. And it will be a space where people can not only learn the skill of archiving, but the methodology and what goes behind it. And we are incredibly excited to share that with everyone as it comes along. So thank you, Devika.
No, thank you so much, Nour, especially in the context of Asia now. I think it's really important not just to look back at past artists and their production, but also what's going to happen in the future in the region, in Asia itself, and how structures like ASAP, I have to say, which I'm also associated with, and very proudly so, are enabling in the region itself. So thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.